Welcome to Citizens for Community Media. This is Peter Helland with Patrick Mangan. Actually, our last show was right before the election, maybe a week or so. And we had the blue hat here, now we have the red hat. And we discussed and compared difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Well, now Donald Trump has won the election, and it's quite a stir because he obviously was not expected to win. Now, there were a couple polls, LA Times, and I watched this Bill Stills. If you were hoping they were right, they were predicting Trump would win. So, it raises questions, how they do things. But I would like to open up with a scripture because we're dealing with government, and of course the scripture addresses the importance of government, that we can't be neutral. It says here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, I exhort, therefore, that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty, for this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. So there we have a command. I exhort, therefore, first of all, prayers, supplications, intercessions, giving of thanks be made for kings and for all that are in authority. And there's a lot of people in authority that God recognizes. And
there are a lot of people in authority. And the one that I heard the most from people who wanted to absolve themselves of participation in the election was to say God is in control. He's in authority. And I'd smile and remind them, God is in authority, and the way he's in authority in America is he has 100 million Christians who have the right to vote and select the next leader of the free world.
Right.
So I think we have a personal responsibility as Christian believers who are self-aware of who they are, self-aware of their calling in the Scriptures in Christ, and really very self-aware that every Christian is an ambassador of the Most High God, and that in this nation in particular, we have this great privilege that we get to choose the leader of the free world, and truly, really the most influential leader in the world. Yeah. And that's what we had the chance to do. So I happily utilized my vote and helped a lot of other people to utilize their votes to elect Donald Trump.
Right, and I'm sure you've probably heard me say it's up to God, so I probably crossed the line a little bit myself. But I suppose, like you played hockey in high school, and sometimes we go to hockey games.
Yeah.
The hockey game does depend on God, but that doesn't mean you can't go 100%, and it doesn't depend.
Well, it reminds me of the story of the farmer and the preacher. And the preacher came to see the farmer's farm, and he took him down to the South 40, and he showed him everything it was growing there, and the corn and all. And the preacher said, "My, isn't it good what God's done?" And he took him up to the northern section, and he showed him all of the cattle grazing, everything he was doing. And he said, "My, look at what the Lord's done." And the farmer took him to the next pasture, and the preacher went on, look at what the Lord's done. And finally the farmer said, "You should have seen this when God had it all by himself." So, God is able, through his manifold wisdom and plan, he spoke the worlds into creation. So yes, he is an unlimited being, but he has chosen to give us the gift of free will, and in so doing has limited himself to our invitation to intercede and to intervene in human affairs. And he has made himself the person to respond to our invitation. So we have this great gift of prayer. And on top of that, in this country, just because we have a constitutional republic, not a socialism, not a totalitarianism,
and not even a constitutional democracy.
No, a constitutional republic. We have the right then to, as the people, this government is up by and for the people. Who are those people? The same people who occupied the church, are the same people who occupy the government and hire the government. So as individual citizens, this great election, and the elections are getting longer. They're like 4-year elections. We elect one, and then we start working on the next one. And people tire of that. But we should never tire of the privilege that we have, that as difficult, as long, as intense as this campaign was, this is the peaceful transition of power. And, I was very disheartened when President Obama was elected. And I was very heartened when Donald Trump was elected. There are other people who are disheartened, when Donald Trump's elected. But in this nation, for better or worse, we do it for president 4 years at a time. And then our Constitution gives us the right to wrestle over all the ideas and to wrestle over whether something that they do is good or bad. And I think we're going to see how much good comes from having a conservative, Christian, pragmatic, businessman leader coming to this unruly federal government and getting it back into the hands of the people. And that's what the Trump election is all about. It's about the people rejected what the Republican establishment wanted them to do. They rejected what the Democratic establishment wanted them to do.
Mm-hmm. They weren't going to be cornered.
They rejected what the media elites and the talking heads and the professors and the political commentator class was telling them they were going to do. And they pushed back on everybody and said, no, you're not going to tell me how I'm going to vote. I'm going to tell you. And that's what they did. And that's why I think so many people got it wrong on Election Day.
Yeah. I was thinking of something there, but the issue that's kind of important to me, and it's because remember Hillary was making this, they asked Trump, are you going to graciously concede if you lose? And he said, well, he obviously he withheld the right, or he kept the right to contest if there was something illegally done.
Yes. Yeah.
And they made a huge thing out of that. And then we see that Hillary lost, and they don't seem to be taking it as gracious as they were demanding Mr. Trump.
No, and about the loss, just a few minutes of political honesty. The race was not as close as it was held out to be. Once there was really an electoral landslide in a sense.
Right,
I mean,
right.
The
popular vote is
the popular vote
is kind of irrelevant. That's not how we are.
It's relevant, but one of the things we have to understand is that we don't stop counting the votes for the Electoral College after a team wins. It's not like a baseball game. We say, okay, well, you struck out, and now that's it. We don't even have to play the rest of the inning because we're already won. We actually count the votes. But then there's ways that we don't count the votes. So a lot of the absentee ballots are not counted unless it changes the outcome of the vote. Now, those ballots were breaking almost 60 to 70% for Republicans. So a lot of people who voted by absentee ballot, their ballots were not counted in that total. Had they been, Hillary would likely have lost the popular vote as well. And so even on election night, holding out 2-3 states so that it wasn't a complete spanking of the Democratic Party and Hillary, there were still some of those shenanigans that night that went on to the next day and the next day. It was not at all close in the Electoral College. And when we look at this, the thing that we have to understand is that what separates us, if we did not have an Electoral College, and when Republicans have lost, they've said, let's do away with it. When Democrats lose, they say let's do away with it.
I think Mr. Trump even was suggesting the Electoral College was a problem, but I disagree.
But the Electoral College is critical for keeping us representative. Otherwise, the presidential campaign would happen in 16 states and nobody'd ever visit any of the other states because that's all the population it takes to accumulate a victory in the popular vote. But the using the type of electoral system we have, it's amazing to me that the founders had the wisdom, the vision really, to see how this might play out and see how they could keep the whole country representative. And I think it suggests this. The founders were much more interested in the state government than they were in a big federal government.
Big time.
And so the Electoral College and a representative republic much more reflects the diversity of the states than it does a centralized form. And that's what we're seeing in these elections. The Electoral College this time represented most of rural and suburban America, and the tiny little sections that went blue, that went Democratic, are all large cities and all urban populations. There's virtually very few, if any, rural populations anywhere. So when you look at this, if you were just going with a straight vote, you could gather a lot of votes in Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia and New York and a few cities in California and somewhere. And you go down to New Orleans and that. And you don't really have the kind of representation that the red nation, that the red states have, in the states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio that went for Trump the same way that the Reagan Democrats went for Reagan. This was a blue-collar uprising, a populist uprising, and it was the people who have been the most negatively impacted by globalism that President Obama, that Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton, and to some extent the Bushes were pushing. This globalism has harmed cities like where I grew up. I worked in the same factory my dad and grandfather did.
Right,
yeah.
right.
So, people in these cities have watched their whole life come apart and go away. The main street they used to walk and shop on that was thriving because of the 5 or 6 factories in town, none of those factories are there, and most of those stores are closed.
No, and my job takes me all throughout Ohio. And, Lima, Dayton, Youngstown. I go through, and they're all devastated. And I couldn't believe they were saying Ohio was going to go for Clinton. I said, how could that be? I talked to these guys. They got so many in their family that lost their jobs. And come to find out, what did Trump win by in Ohio?
Yeah, I mean, this was the election when the working class, the blue collar people, stood up and said, "Nobody's listening to us, and we hear what you're saying, but we categorically reject it. You can't tell us, you can't tell anybody that the unemployment rate is 4.5% when there's 94 million people out of work." And you can't try to pull the wool over our eyes and say, well, we're going to discount the 75 million who've stopped looking because they're so disheartened. We're going to say they're not really wanting a job. Well, that's a lie, and most people understand that it's a lie, but you'll see the media and Democrats try to raise that flag over President Obama's presidency, which has been a disaster. And we'll try to pretend that, well, these are the way we keep the rates and this is what the rates are. No, when you have 94 million people out of work, that is your unemployment. And I think we should count the same in the Trump administration as well, because he's not inheriting a 4.5 unemployment rate. He's inheriting a 20% unemployment rate. And that's what the new administration is going to have to embrace and really turn around economically to get people in America happy.
Now, don't you think that we both went to Notre Dame, and I look back in Wisconsin, now my brother's one of his best friends is all for Trump, and so we're kind of on the same wavelength for various reasons. But he's finding, like his sister's a PhD, now he's more of a blue collar kind of guy, okay? I mean, I just know his background. He's more blue collar. Yeah. He's not really into the whole education thing, okay? And just because you go to Notre Dame doesn't mean you're into the whole education thing necessarily as far as the elitist thinking. education scene, the more education, the more they tend to go for Hillary. I mean, or am I wrong?
Well, I mean, you have two things happening there. One is what kind of education. The more liberal, secular, culture transforming education you have, the more you end up on the left. And,
But a lot of schools, you take the Ivy League schools, I mean, you take a lot of schools, that's where they tend to push kids.
I think there's fundamental questions about the efficacy of what schools are teaching, because the same bias we've seen in journalism. I started off as a journalist, and I started off writing, for a daily newspaper, and I spent time reporting on a radio station, and I was taught that if you're going to do the news, you have to be objective.
Right, you said that on the last show.
And if you have a way that you want to skew the audience, and you don't disclose that and do an editorial, you're a yellow journalist. It's all yellow today. Everybody is shopping a narrative, and you see it in local news, you see it in even local editorial pages, you see it everywhere, where the media is now one of the advocates, but it still sometimes wears the mask of objectivity. And what the election proved is that there's no objectivity at all. Well, they were kind of in the tank for Hillary, and they did Hillary a disservice in the sense that, her gang was all prepared with the fireworks in New York Harbor, and they were all getting ready to pop the champagne corks and all of that. And they had no idea how far off the reporting was, and how far off the echo chamber they were living in was from where the average American person was.
Well, what Scripture says, they teach things which they ought not to, for filthy lucre's sake. Now, this is stepping on your toes, maybe, but I'm reading Sean Hannity, which of course was Trump, and that's but he's going to get paid $37 million. Now, when you're getting paid $37 million, are you going to tell me your objectivity on truth is going to stay even keeled? I'm saying money is playing a factor in objectivity here.
I think the fact that the fact that the people who get the wealthiest out of elections are the media, that's where all the wealth goes. It's in the billions of dollars spent on television ads. So, I mean, you can make the argument in any direction. I mean, I don't think that money is evil, and I don't think that money passing hands is evil. I think it's evil if it's dishonest.
Well, if the 30 pieces of silver are causing you to...
If it is a dishonest scale, God hates a dishonest scale. Like if you're going to do polling, and you assume that there are 14% more Democrats than Republicans, so you overpoll 14% Democrats in every poll, and you pretend like you took a random sample, that's lying. That's a dishonest scale. And that's what the American people rejected and said, we're not stupid, and, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And, the American people have rejected that. I don't think that the media will ever hold the same place. It's been falling for years, but I think this was the moment when people turned away from the media, and the Trump supporters in particular, bound together by the hundreds of thousands in individual groups in Facebook and Twitter, and they just simply turned off all the network news because it didn't resemble any reality that they lived in. When the network news reported on their economic condition, it was clueless. It didn't have anything to do with where they lived.
Yeah.
In the supposed recoveries and all these supposed good things that were happening, nobody could relate to any of those.
Well, don't you think, on a practical level, people that are in media probably went through journalism in high school, might have been part of the yearbook or whatever. Notre Dame, when you come across those people that work for the Observer, my experience is they're very liberal and they're hard to talk to. When you write a letter to the Observer that's conservative or like, well, I want to write, they're not going to want to publish it.
Yeah, you're going to have to write to the Rover. And this is a point now that we basically have a handful of media who tell both sides, and we call them conservative media. And then we have a big swash of media that only tells one side, and we call that the mainstream media. But what's happened is the American people don't care about the illusions and the ivory towers that everybody's sitting in. They care about where they live, and this was an election about where they live, and they don't like the huge, gigantic leap to the left. They don't like transgender bathrooms. They don't like sending boys into the girls' room. They don't like forcing homosexuality on the nation. They don't like abortion and killing 60 million babies and calling it heroic and calling it compassionate, the height of hypocrisy. I think Hillary did herself in with many thoughtful voters who were watching when she defended abortion through birth on the third debate. And I think that's when America looked and just said, my God, this woman is further left than any voice we've ever seen in national politics. And she didn't flinch at that. And people started to recoil. They started to recoil. So, and then this election was a lot about what was going to happen with the Supreme Court. And we know that the people that Hillary was appointing and that she would have appointed and that the Democrats in Congress would like to have had confirmed are people who want to put public funding behind abortion, not just stop it, overturn it, outlaw it, and help women to carry their babies to term, but wanted to actually reverse that process, do more abortions, and put public funding behind it. We knew that her answer to inner city violence isn't about telling black men to stop killing other black men, and by the way, stop killing police all over the country, but her solution was going to be take all the guns away. And so these things just don't work. That's not the America that was founded. It's never been that liberal left America that liberals have dreamed that they might transform it into one day. America is going to continue to believe in God. America is going to continue to reject abortion. America is going to continue to reject aberrant sexual practices that worship the individual's choice rather than the truth of God. Mm-hmm. And America is going to continue to require that it has the ability to protect itself and even to rebel against the tyrannical government, which is why the Second Amendment is there. So all of these issues, taken all together, you put these together, Trump had a way of being the voice for the people who weren't being heard, who weren't being seen, who weren't being reported on. And what he did was take what so many of us were feeling and articulate it. And immediately people looked and said, you know, I feel like I'm for Trump, but I don't even know if I should be. But, man, he's saying what I want to hear said.
Well, part of it was Jeremiah 6 and Jeremiah 18. One, it says, return to the old path, and one says, return to the ancient path. Mm-hmm. In a part, this was, like you said, the move to the left was so sudden and so radical, you couldn't help but notice it. See, if they were strategic, they would do it, they would make the changes so you don't notice it. But this time, it was so noticeable. And so now the call to go back to some traditional ways, to the ancient path, and ideally, it's the time for the preacher to say, mm-hmm. what we're trying to get back to is the biblical Christian old path. And so it's really, the church needs to take this opportunity and start directing people to where they really are supposed to be going.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think many of the commentators after the fact acknowledged they had gotten it wrong, and they said this was the voice of those who had been left behind, who were not being represented, who were not being spoken on behalf of, taking back their country. And the idea is, where are we going? And there's this big argument. Do we return to the things that made us successful in our founding and embrace those timeless values forever? Or do we morph into some modern creation that is up with the times and is global? And the question right now, and I think the biggest question in this election, is globalism versus nationalism. And nationalism is not isolationism. Nationalism says we're going to put America first because we're Americans. We're going to keep our home base strong. I mean, you consider this. You consider that we have so many hundreds of billions of dollars going out to other countries in foreign aid, which basically we were just buying the peace. We're giving everybody money to buy the peace. Then we're putting out all the money to pay for NATO and pay for the protection of our NATO partners that go back to World War II. And then on top of that, we're cutting our military back while we're paying to protect someone else. We're cutting back our own infrastructure while we're paying for, countries like Iraq in their infrastructure.
So in other words, we're being directed by a false ideology because it makes no sense. Why would we inflict this upon ourselves unless we're blinded by a false ideology? Well, we got to do this because it's right.
Yeah, we're past the time when there's two superpowers and everybody else is like picking up the team. You don't win much by winning a third world country except a bill. That's what you win now. If you win that battle,
$20 trillion.
So if you were a small country, the United States and the Soviet Union would send your kids to school and would buy you things and give you money and defend you and do all these things. We're in a post dual superpower world, and now we've got the United States and Russia and China in this one world, and then we've got the emerging countries and the BRIC countries coming up, and then we've got a lot of other countries that are smaller by nature who are trying to figure out where they're at. And the one thing that has made everything work is when America's strong. When America's strong, America tends to stand for what is good. And if America is thought to be strong, it inhibits those who are going to do bad things.
If we have good people in rulership, but you could
if we have good people in rulership,
Hillary Clinton is not good. Could you argue that?
Absolutely. You could argue that Hillary was not good. You could argue that Hillary did not reflect the values that made America great. Hence, make America great again, and the American people embrace that.
She claimed to go by the Bible.
She had a relationship back to a very radical, really teacher in Bill Ayers and looking at this, rule book for radicals and looking at Saul Alinsky. And when you go back to these and you look at Saul Alinsky, what he was doing, he hated America, and he wanted to see America taken apart and transformed into a socialism. And his rules for radicals, the book is actually dedicated to Lucifer, the ultimate radical. So the original radical. So, this was one of Hillary and Obama's connection points, was the rules for radicals. Now, most Americans didn't get that. It was talked about all over the social media, all over the talk radio, but it was never given any play in the mainstream news. Why is it that most Americans don't know that the most influential book in both Hillary and Obama's life was dedicated to Lucifer? Why don't they know that?
They don't want to know it. They don't want to know
because
it. People know what they want to know.
Because we did not report that. That was not reported in the mainstream media. If that were true, if a Republican quoted a book like that was dedicated to Lucifer, it'd be 2-inch headlines tomorrow to try to drive a wedge. So here we have now, the question is, now that we have this Trump revolution, what's it going to look like? What does it mean? And I think, the first thing that it means is that there's going to be a lot of undoing of what Obama did that the country did not like, did not want, and felt that was forced upon it. And I think particularly all of this, pen and the cell phone stuff that he's been doing the last 2 or 3 years, and the closer he gets to the end, the more radical he becomes. We're going to tear up all that stuff and get back to even and then start moving forward. But I think what we're going to see from Trump is the Trump effect. Reagan had an effect. When Iran saw that Reagan was going to be the next president, they quickly made a deal and got the hostage back over here because they thought he's going to invade.
Right. Now let me just back a little bit. You have children. Let me see. The youngest is still in high school.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's say your life is high school. Let's say your life is 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, and as a parent, your kids are there, so your life is there in a way, because your kids are there. What's the Trump effect for somebody that lives in the high school environment? Is there an effect at all? Are they affected? Is the classroom going to be more orderly? I mean, these are good questions.
Without saying which one, I can tell you that one of my children came to me at 2:45 in the morning and gave me a big hug and a kiss and said, "I'm so glad he won. I thought they were going to steal the election." And so, it can have a very inspiring effect on it. There has been the teachers, although many of them have been conservatives, are forced into the very liberal teachers union. And the teachers union is a very negative influence in our country right now. And because it's an anti-parent, anti-faith, anti-God, anti-church, anti-religious liberty approach. So they had kids, who almost needed counseling because Hillary Clinton was not elected president. And when you see how fragile it has given rise to, we have the Gen Xers, and then we had the millennials, and now they're being called the snowflake generation. And you say, well, what's that? And that's it. They're called snowflakes because if you put any heat on them, they melt.
Or what's the social justice warrior?
So this whole idea, that people should be wringing their hands because Trump got in office. Look, Hillary was the one who apparently went on a drunken binge and was, couldn't be brought to the stage the night she lost and was throwing things, and there's reports that are coming through from media on that. She's the one that didn't have the temperament to have her finger on the button. She's the one that has a whole history of her life. The people who served her, protected her, who were around her, one after the other testifies of throwing off into a rage constantly. You can't hide it. But that was never really reported by the mainstream media. You had to read that on the Breitbarts, and you had to read that somewhere else. You had to read it on alternative media. So I think one of the biggest stories about all of this is that part of the people taking back their country is taking back their media. If you're going to be in the media and you're a liberal, you had better learn to be objective, because this media is not objective.
Well, that's the whole idea.
And it has been categorically rejected. And I don't know that there's a lot of people coming back. Like we've seen, as media itself has come apart. First when cable hit and you had hundreds of channels and you undid the network monopoly, now it's very hard to hold electronic audiences. And people are going more online or direct news, or now the kind of self-reporting that people are doing with a cell phone and posting on Facebook or live streaming. So there's a lot of sources for news, and right now everybody can kind of insulate themselves. I sometimes people will want to debate, and sometimes I'll debate them a little bit, but what I find is that people use their own sources, and they've got liberal sources, and you can't really have a very good debate because one person, I said, we should stop talking because I think we're thoroughly disinterested in each other's opinion, in each other's sources, in each other's facts, and there's really not a point in trying to debate. Maybe we ought to try to figure out if there's anything we agree on. Let's go back to some real basic things. I think the American people are going to have to try to figure this out in terms of the healing. One of the things I think is not going to do well is obvious hypocrisy. The media, after having gotten the entire election wrong, after having given the leverage to Hillary all the way through, after doing everything they could to discourage, bemoan, deride Trump supporters, look, the deplorables are not going away. You think that the Expendables film series is a hit? Wait and see how long Deplorables goes on. That was one of the greatest gifts Hillary could ever have given to the Donald Trump movement, because and the Trump campaign had nothing to do with that. That came from Facebook. It was instantaneous, and everybody, is just deplorable. I mean, it went crazy. Well, people are going to take that, and they're going to take those identities. They're not going to give those up. Those are badges of honor now. And what's going to have to be figured out is this. This is not the time for lawless men of any color, but particularly not for lawless black men to be attacking police. I worked in the civil rights movement my whole adult life, And I saw President Obama race bait for 7 years and drive wedges between that I don't know that we'll get out. I mean, it's like we've lost a lot of the progress. And at the point in time when white people believed they had shown their best faith, trusting in some hope and change with a black president, they've been accused of the worst behavior. And now the worst behavior is being practiced by the accusers, who are specifically targeting white police officers who are doing racist, hideous things in the name of raising the black cause. That destroys the black cause. Nobody wants to hear about the black cause if you have people going out killing police officers. It just makes everyone angry. It makes everyone angry. So there's going to have to be some choices made that are tough, because generally speaking, the blue states, the blue cities really tend to opt for urban solutions, and the red states tend to opt for suburban and rural solutions. And the cities, 10 cities in the country are not going to demand that the whole United States bow down and worship them. That's not happening. And so cities are going to have to get a different viewpoint. Like, for example, we've had a number of liberal big city mayors whose cities are in shambles as far as peace is concerned. They have terrible murder rates. And they're getting up and they're declaring they are going to defy the federal government, they're going to defy President Trump, and they are going to have these sanctuary cities even if they're, even as they're outlawed. Well, those mayors are going to find themselves with a very determined president, attorney general. They may find themselves in jail. They're certainly going to find themselves losing federal funding if they hold those places, because the American people have spoken and said, we don't want sanctuary cities. We don't want illegal immigration. We want a wall. We want security, border security first. Then we'll decide on what's going to happen next with all the illegals who are here. And if you're an illegal and you've committed a crime, you might as well pack your bags and get out now. And if you're an illegal and you haven't committed a crime, then you better get ready to get in line with everybody else. One of my friends, one of my son's close friends, he's Mexican, and he's going to become a naturalized citizen soon. They've been around the country for probably 10 or 15 years. So there's a difference between the person who's illegal, who pretends to be an American, gets a false driver's license, signs up for false benefits, steals the goodies from America, and hides in the shadows, and those who knock on the front door, and we say, get in line, and they say, but it's a long line. We say, I know, but everybody wants to get in here.
Well, isn't it kind of like, you're supposed to wait till you I was just in the school doing mentoring, and I know what's important to tell these young kids, sixth graders. You wait till you're married before you have sex, okay? It's called an illegitimate child, okay? But we don't care about that anymore, Well, we should. And we should care about somebody that's illegal, because boundaries define what a nation is, right? And if you're violating the rules of immigration, and how legit you are, but we don't care about what's legit. I mean, we don't even have a moral compass on these issues.
We're in this situation where we're confronted with timeless truth. God hates those who move the ancient boundary stones. In other words, you cannot go around, undoing the things that they are in an improper way. So right now, we have seen leaders like Trump echoing leaders like Reagan, echoing earlier leaders saying things like, a nation with no borders is no nation at all. Borders are a big deal. They count. They're to be respected. We tell our sons, stay out of our daughters' rooms. That's a boundary.
You don't have to tell. The daughters will do it.
So this is a boundary. When we stop taking respect, when we stop making respect for boundaries, we run into problems. This is why this sort of tantrum that's going on about, my son might, think he's a girl, so I want him in the bathroom with your daughter. And I love the parents who stand up and say, I don't care what your son thinks he is, he's not getting in the bathroom with my daughter. And I'll add an extra one, he's not getting in the bathroom with my wife. And so, that doesn't mean I don't care about sons and daughters who are sexually confused and experiencing intense emotional pain. They need to be helped through to understand and be brought into perfect harmony with their biological sex. There aren't 58 different sexual varieties like Facebook has offered, and they aren't unlimited like Facebook has offered. I say, I'll just make up your own. It's a complete joke, but it's not a joke when you try to do public policy and you say, okay, well, wait, sexual harassment is if you let men in a women's restroom. That's sexual harassment. But if the man thinks he's a woman, who might think he's, a woman who's a lesbian, then what does that mean? This is ridiculous.
Of course it's ridiculous. No,
this is ridiculous public policy, and this is part of the common sense rising up and saying, look, guys, we want to know, what are you going to do about North Korea? What are you going to do about Iran? What are you going to do about this awkward place we are with Russia in the world? What are you going to do about China? Stop telling me that you want me to get involved in all of these illusory, made-up sexual identity fantasies, and you want to have all these different bathrooms to accommodate all these different things. You want to use 58 different pronouns to describe these. That's all nonsense.
Of course. Now, what do you think
Let's get to the real issues.
What do you think about North Carolina? Because the governor there is contesting the election, and a big part of it is the one that's contesting it is against the transgender thing, and the other one's for it. But now it's down to the ballots being counted, and they're trying to say, well, he doesn't have a right to contest it. But you're familiar with how fraudulent these things are, and it's over it's on the transgender issue.
I think that what we're going to see, one of the things that came out through all the battling is that when the familiar refrain that I see dead people and they vote Democrat came out, when all the Republicans said, look, 98% of dead people vote Democrat, there was actually an explanation offered for this, that actually there's 2.5 million people who die every year, and we don't get them off the rolls fast enough. So we know there's at least 2 million dead people who are conceivably still on the rolls. The fact that they're on the rolls is not upsetting. The fact that they're voting is very upsetting. This is something that we look at there every time we heard there is no such thing as voter fraud. We saw 10 more examples of it. And again, the American people said to the media, to the elites, stop it. The emperor has no clothes on. Of course there's cheating. Of course when Obama gets 150% of the registered voters in a given county, in Ohio, there's a problem. Of course when there's 40 precincts in Philadelphia, there's not a single Republican vote, there's a problem. Of course, when you go in and in front of voters, while they were voting, they watched their votes switch, on these pads, to go Democratic, to go from Republican to Democratic, and they did it 3 times, and they bring the poll worker over, and they bring the leader over, and it does it all. Of course there's a problem. That's not a glitch. That's dishonesty.
So this guy's behind by 6,500. Yeah. That's still a tight race, right? Because of all this play.
Everything is still a tight race, and it's people say, well, if there's so much fraud, why don't you challenge more often? I've helped people in a lot of campaigns, and I've been there on election night. And unless you know precisely where that fraud is at, there's 2 reasons you don't. 1, it costs so much money, so you have to know exactly what you're looking for. And 2, if you charge fraud and you don't sustain that charge and you lose an election, you are probably done in politics for good because you didn't do it the right way, and you seem to be a sore loser. So at that point, we have to clean up our system. I mean, we go through all these things. I went to get one of my kids a driver's permit. It took me 3 trips, and you got to go do this, and you got to get that, and you got to get this out of the safety deposit box. You got to have that, and you got to have this. And then we have people who are walking in from other countries, and we have illegals who are voting in California. It just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I think people are getting the handle on that. And now what the American people want is they want the wall. And somebody said, well, you're not really talking about a wall. You're talking about fences. And Trump said concrete. This is like the Great Wall of America. So, they're going to debate these things. Because Paul Ryan, he's closer to a lot of Democrats than he is to the base that elected Donald Trump. And the base that elected Donald Trump would be happy to see Paul Ryan perhaps leave the speakership.
Well, what do you think about Minnesota? Okay. They voted for Hillary. Indiana was what? 62% to what? 36%?
Yeah.
That's a huge difference between the state of Indiana and Minnesota.
Yeah.
What's that say about Minnesota people?
Well, I think one of the things,
or any state.
I think what it says is that in this country, the vice president was very gracious and gave a great compliment, to those who put on the play Hamilton, and he showed great regard for them in doing that. They were crass, and they there were people who booed and cheered as he came in. And he turned to his daughter and said, that's the sound of freedom. That's freedom. You get to disagree. I always thought that was just the sound of Irish because I grew up Irish. But, because we had that disagreement all the time.
Yeah.
But, what we're seeing today, though, is that those who were horrible to George Bush the whole time he was elected nearly worshiped Barack Obama and can't even deal with the facts. They're still calling 94 million people unemployed, 4.5% unemployment, are now the same people who are calling out Donald Trump and, in this case, basically sideswiping the Vice President of the United States, having a performer think to lecture the Vice President of the United States on inclusion, when in fact, in their calls for those who would be involved, they said only non-whites were welcome. And on top of that racism, there is the fact that in his personal conduct, he very offensively said that St. Patrick's Day is open season on drunk white girls. So he talks about trying to, defame drunk white girls. So this is a guy who has no integrity whatsoever. He's just a popular performer. And I suspect that he lost a lot of his popularity as a performer when he sought to try to aggrandize himself by
he was morally superior
by attacking Mike Pence. And Mike Pence is a personal friend. He is a gentleman in all cases, and he was in that case. He empathized with them. He was kind to them. He complimented their showmanship. He left it open as to whether or not that was the right venue for it, was perfectly gracious. He won that exchange. They came out looking petulant and, frankly, infantile.
Well, what do you think if this was past January 20th and he actually is now vice president, and you're a father in the home? I've never married, but you can't allow your kids. Jesus said, if your children curse you, you're to put them to death. Now, we're gonna interpret that friendly, but if you're the president or you're the vice president, at a certain point, you have a duty to demand respect for that office.
Well, I think one of the things that we see today is there's a difference between demanding and commanding. And I think that Mike Pence is the type of fellow who's not going to demand respect. But he is such a fine man that he commands respect. So that I think a lot of those who are on the liberal side of the equation are probably cringing at what the Hamilton Star did, because they know that Mike Pence had the high moral ground.
He doesn't have any skeletons in his closet, does he?
That they had no skeletons in his closet. And also the fact is that they took the low moral ground. And, if what that actor did was more a breach of the cultural mores. Actors don't come out of character and start lecturing anybody. Not anybody who's there. When you come and you honor, there is an unspoken contract between the performer and the people who come as an audience. And that performer is there to entertain and to create a different reality, not to then use that as their own little soapbox to give a speech on. Is it allowed by the First Amendment? Absolutely. Was it wise? Absolutely not.
No. He didn't gain that many points.
He didn't gain any. I think he lost a bunch. And I think what they'll see is that liberals and conservatives enjoyed Hamilton and enjoyed its particular unique artistic approach to understanding history. But what you're going to find is that a lot of people are going to find it distasteful now when, number one, they didn't know what a poor morality he had, and that has come up since he did this. That's what
people did their homework, right?
They did their homework, and they said, oh, my, this is a guy who talks about violating white girls on St. Patrick's Day, and so he's a very base kind of person. We thought he was this great star. He's nobody. And then on top of that, he acts like, he's superior to a very decent man. Now, Donald Trump was absolutely irate about this, and he tweeted about it. And I hope he keeps his Twitter account, and I hope he keeps tweeting, because the American people want somebody who'll say it like it is. And he said the cast member, of Hamilton was extremely rude, and he owes Mike Pence, a great guy, an apology. He owes him an apology as the vice president of the country. Nobody should seek to denigrate him when he has come and actually given them an honor by coming and drawing attention to their program by attending it himself.
He's consistent. The actor is consistent. What he did on St. Patrick's Day, what he wanted to do on St. Patrick's Day, is consistent to what he just did there.
So, what's going to happen is this. Everybody is going to have a little restraint. But here's the things that are going to happen. We're going to see the corporate tax rates go down. We're going to see the repatriation of foreign companies who were United States companies who left to avoid the tax rate. They're going to be repatriated. Here's another thing that's going to happen. We're going to see those who decide to headquarter in another country and then want to sell their products here at the advantage of the lower rates of labor rates in another country, they're going to get tariffed or they're going to get taxed so that they don't have that advantage, and it's better to just stay home and make it here. And furthermore, those like China, who's a currency manipulator and who's been called out for this, for four different terms, we've seen people trying to call out China, and they're just like stone-faced. They will not answer. Donald Trump calls them out in the middle of a debate, and suddenly the premier of China is out there talking about this. So that's another part of the Trump effect. People are not sure who Trump is. They're not sure how far he'll go. They don't know if he's going to create a tariff war, so they're going to be much more likely to come to the table, try to find a peaceful way, because, it's like when Reagan was in. Gaddafi started getting involved, Lockerbie, the downed Scottish airliner. Mm-hmm. Reagan sent the F-16s to Gaddafi's house.
I know.
Smart bombs down the chimney. So everybody said, oh, my gosh, he's a cowboy. You don't know what he's going to do next. He's one of our most peaceful and thoughtful presidents ever. But that's what people thought. So it had the effect of making our enemies think twice before they did bad things. And our friends really trusted us and liked having a strong president, a strong United States.
Do you think what's going on here is kind of a patriarchy thing, that the reason they don't like Trump, he tends to be more patriarchal, and that he asserts dominion? I mean, is there any of that going on here? I mean, I'm trying to figure out why they don't like Trump. What's going on?
I think that the big divide is conservative, liberal, pro-Bible, against the Bible. If you're an atheist and if you're going to tend to lean away from Trump on the social issues. But whether you're an atheist or a Christian, you're going to tend to lean towards him on national security issues and on economic issues, which is what we kind of saw. There was the widest coalition I've ever seen in politics was Donald Trump's coalition. And
3 minutes.
And so when we look at that, there's a lesson learned. There's a lot of people have a lot of things in common. I think the dynamic between men and women in the campaign is that, and I think that, especially among Christian women, I think many of the Christian women they compared Donald Trump to their husband, and they said, I wouldn't want to be married to him. And so therefore, I'm against all that.
So there was some of that, yeah.
But the men said, here's a man's man. This is another form of a John Wayne, and we haven't seen that kind of swagger in a long time. And this is somebody who's doing it for good, and he's also the kind of guy that you can have a battle with on Tuesday, and he'll hit you really hard on Wednesday, and by Friday he'll make friends with you.
Well, he's
and
making
let
friends with Mitt Romney.
bygones.
What do you think of that? Romney was basically calling him anything but the devil.
This is why people want a businessman in office. They want a guy who understands, look, we can have battles and fights, but then we'll be okay. Ronald Reagan, called the Soviet Empire the evil empire, comparing to the Star Wars metaphor, and then it brought them to the end of themselves. And when he and Gorbachev and others were, starting to get along some, they said, do you still think it's the evil empire? He just gently said no and let it go. Why? Well, you're probably not going to hear a gentle no from Donald Trump, but he's going to change it. And this is the point. Trump is now acting like Lincoln did when he embraced his rivals and brought them in, not the rivals who were on the other side against him, but the ones who were on his side against him. He brought them into and had a very powerful presidency. However you feel about everything that happened during that time, he had a very powerful presidency. I think Donald Trump is going to have a very powerful presidency, and I believe that it is going to bring prosperity back to America.
Well, and I think we need to pray, like we opened up here. We need to pray for kings and those in authority, because I do believe Trump got elected because of prayer.
Yeah.
Okay? And he's only going to succeed because of prayer.
And voting.
Well, of course.
You pray on your knees, but you vote on your feet. Keep voting, Christians.
This is Citizens for Community Media, and we believe that the corporate media controls the discourse in an unhealthy way, and that's why these kind of platforms at a local level are very important. So we encourage everybody to support their local media, especially here in South Bend. So till next time, Peter Helland and Pat Mangan.